Dr. Bell speaking.
Yes, sir. General, understood.
The
We're
rain
initiating
fell in
trauma
sheets that
protocols
Tuesday night
immediately.
in November,
Captain, if you'll come with
hammering
us.
against the emergency room windows of Mercy General Hospital like a relentless drummer, announcing the arrival of something terrible. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting that sickly pallor across the waiting room that only hospitals seem to possess, that particular shade of hopelessness mixed with antiseptic despair. In 3 hours, the Chicago Police Department would receive a call that would change everything. In 3 hours, a Pentagon general would be scrambling to contain a situation that threatened to expose secrets buried deeper than any grave. In 3 hours, the blood pooling on the linoleum floor of the emergency department would belong to men who had walked in believing themselves predators. But for now, in this moment, the wolf was sleeping in the corner, and nobody knew he was there. His name was Daniel Marsh, though nobody at Mercy General knew that. To them, he was just another homeless veteran, another piece of human wreckage washed up on the shores of society's indifference. He sat in the corner of the waiting room, wrapped in an army surplus jacket that had seen better decades, his gray beard matted and unkempt, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. He had been sitting there for 6 hours. The triage nurse, a woman named Patricia with tired eyes and a clipboard that never seemed to leave her hand, had taken his vitals once, written something dismissive, and moved on to patients who mattered. Patients with insurance cards, patients with families hovering nearby, patients who didn't smell like the underside of the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Daniel Marsh didn't complain. He never complained. Complaining required energy he no longer possessed, required caring about outcomes he had long since accepted would never favor him. He simply sat, waiting, his left hand pressed against his abdomen where something sharp and persistent had been gnawing at him for 3 weeks now. The pain had started as a whisper. Now it was screaming. But Daniel Marsh had known worse pain. He had known the kind of pain that comes when you watch your entire unit get vaporized by an IED in the Korengal Valley. He had known the pain of holding your best friend's intestines in your hands while calling for a medevac that would arrive 4 minutes too late. He had known the pain of coming home to a country that had forgotten you existed the moment you stepped off the transport plane. This pain in his gut was nothing. This pain was manageable. What wasn't manageable was the way the security guard kept looking at him. The guard's name tag read Marcus, and Marcus had the particular expression of a man who had been given just enough authority to become dangerous. He stood by the vending machines, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Daniel like a hawk watching a field mouse. Daniel didn't react. Reacting was for people who still had something to prove. The clock on the wall ticked past 11 p.m. The waiting room had thinned out, leaving only the truly desperate, the truly sick, and the truly forgotten. A mother with a feverish child, an elderly man clutching his chest, convinced he was dying but unwilling to interrupt the nurses who seemed perpetually busy, a young woman with mascara-stained cheeks and bruises on her wrists that told a story she would never speak aloud. And Daniel Marsh, the invisible man, the ghost of wars that America had already forgotten. Dr. Harrison Chen walked through the emergency department like a man who owned not just this hospital, but the concept of medicine itself. He was 42, handsome in that polished way that came from expensive suits and carefully cultivated arrogance. His white coat pristine despite the chaos that swirled around him. He had graduated top of his class at Johns Hopkins. He had published papers in journals that medical students memorized. He had a corner office and a parking space with his name on it. He also had a patient load that was crushing him, a divorce settlement that was bankrupting him, and a prescription drug habit that was slowly killing him. But nobody knew about that last part. Not yet. Chen stopped at the triage desk, flipping through charts with the casual disregard of a man who saw patients as problems to be solved rather than people to be helped. His eyes landed on the intake form that Patricia had filled out 6 hours ago. "Who's the vagrant in the corner?" Patricia looked up from her computer. Came in complaining of abdominal pain, no insurance, no identification, no address. Says his name is Daniel Marsh, but I couldn't verify anything. Has anyone actually examined him? He's been triaged. Vitals were stable. We've had actual emergencies tonight, Dr. Chen. The shooting victim in Trauma 2, the cardiac arrest in room 7, I don't need a list of our failures, Patricia. I need to know why we have a homeless person taking up space in my waiting room for 6 hours. He's a patient, Dr. Chen. He's a liability. Chen's voice carried the particular coldness of a man who had forgotten why he entered medicine in the first place. Get security to escort him out. Point him toward Cook County. They deal with his kind. Patricia hesitated. Doctor, he really does seem to be in pain. If you could just... Did I ask for your medical opinion? Nurse? Chen's eyes were chips of ice. Do your job. Clear the room. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing with the authority of a man who had never been told no. Daniel Marsh heard every word. He had exceptional hearing, a remnant of 23 years in special operations where the difference between hearing a twig snap and not hearing it was the difference between breathing and bleeding out in some forgotten valley. He heard the contempt in Chen's voice. He heard the resignation in Patricia's sigh. He heard the security guard's boots approaching across the linoleum. He also heard something else. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a sound that didn't belong in a hospital emergency room. It was the sound of metal sliding against nylon, the distinctive whisper of a weapon being drawn from concealment. Daniel's eyes shifted without his head moving, a skill that had kept him alive through 17 deployments and more black operations than the Pentagon would ever acknowledge. He tracked the sound to the main entrance, where 3 men had just walked through the automatic doors. They moved wrong. That was the only way to describe it. They moved like men who were pretending to be something they weren't. Their clothes were civilian, unremarkable hoodies and jeans and work boots, but their posture was military. Their eyes were scanning the room in a pattern that Daniel recognized instantly, the overlapping arcs of a tactical sweep. The man in front was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders like a professional linebacker and hands that looked capable of crushing skulls. The 2 flanking him were smaller but no less dangerous, their jackets bulging slightly in ways that suggested concealed weapons. Daniel's assessment took less than 2 seconds. Threat level, maximum. Training. Military or paramilitary. Weapons. At least 1 pistol per individual, possible long gun in the duffel bag the big one was carrying. Objective. Unknown. But this was not a social visit. The big man approached the reception desk. His name, though Daniel wouldn't learn it until later, was Viktor Kozlov, a former Spetsnaz operative who had traded his allegiance to Mother Russia for the more lucrative services of private military contractors. He had killed 37 people in his career, 19 of them with his bare hands. He considered himself an artist, and death was his medium. "I need to see a patient," Victor said, his accent thick, his smile thin. Room 7, the cardiac arrest. The receptionist, a young woman named Amy who had been having a perfectly boring night until this moment, looked up with the automatic politeness of someone trained to deal with difficult visitors. "I'm sorry, sir, but room 7 is currently restricted. If you're family, I can check with the attending physician." "I am not family." Victor leaned forward, and something in his eyes made Amy's words die in her throat. "I am something much more important. The patient in room 7 has information that belongs to people who do not accept the word no. You will take me to him now, or this hospital will become a very different kind of emergency." Amy's hand moved toward the silent alarm under her desk. She never made it. Victor's hand shot out with the speed of a striking cobra, grabbing her wrist and twisting it in a way that made her gasp but not scream. The pain was precise, controlled, a professional's touch. "That would be a mistake," Victor whispered. "A mistake that your co-workers would pay for. Do you understand?" Amy nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Good. Now, room 7, quietly." The 2 men flanking Victor fanned out, one moving toward the waiting room, the other toward the corridor leading to the emergency department's inner sanctum. They moved with the efficiency of a unit that had worked together many times, that had spilled blood together and would spill more tonight without hesitation. Daniel Marsh watched it all unfold. His training screamed at him to act, to move, to neutralize the threat before it could fully manifest, but his training also told him to assess, to wait, to understand the full scope of the situation before committing to action. There were civilians everywhere. The woman with the sick child, the elderly man, The young woman with the bruises, the nurses and orderlies and doctors going about their business, oblivious to the predators that had just entered their midst. One wrong move, and this hospital would become a killing floor. The man moving toward the waiting room passed within 3 feet of Daniel's position. He didn't even glance at the homeless veteran hunched in the corner, his eyes scanning for threats and finding none. Daniel was invisible, beneath notice, exactly as he had intended, but Daniel noticed everything. He noticed the way the man's jacket hung slightly heavier on the right side, indicating a holstered weapon. He noticed the calluses on the man's knuckles, the kind that came from years of hand-to-hand combat training. He noticed the small tattoo on the man's neck, partially hidden by his collar, a symbol that Daniel recognized from intelligence briefings he wasn't supposed to remember. The man was a ghost, an operative from one of the private military companies that did the dirty work governments couldn't acknowledge. Daniel had worked alongside men like this. He had also killed men like this, in places that didn't exist on any map, for reasons that would never appear in any history book. The second man reached the corridor leading to the emergency department. He produced a key card, likely stolen or cloned, and swiped it through the reader. The door clicked open, and he disappeared into the sterile white labyrinth beyond. Victor pushed Amy ahead of him, following the second man, leaving the first to secure the waiting room. The clock on the wall ticked past 11:15. Daniel Marsh made a decision. He didn't stand up immediately. Standing up immediately would draw attention, and attention was the enemy of effective action. Instead, he shifted his weight, a subtle movement that any observer would interpret as the restless fidgeting of an uncomfortable homeless man. His hand slipped into the pocket of his army surplus jacket. Inside that pocket was a gift from a life he had tried to leave behind. It was a knife, a custom-made fixed blade with a 4-inch edge that could slice through bone like butter. He had carried it for 30 years, through jungles and deserts and mountains and cities. It had saved his life more times than he could count. Tonight, it might save other lives as well. The man securing the waiting room, whose name was Alexei Petrov, positioned himself near the main entrance, blocking the exit while maintaining a clear line of sight to the entire room. He looked bored, confident, the posture of a man who expected no resistance from the sheep he was guarding. He had no idea that one of the sheep was actually a wolf. Daniel's mind ran through scenarios with the cold efficiency of a computer calculating trajectories. Distance to target, approximately 15 feet. Obstacles, 2 rows of plastic chairs, 1 potted plant, 1 child's toy left on the floor. Civilians in potential crossfire, 7, including the mother with the sick child directly in the line between Daniel and the target. Unacceptable. He needed to change the geometry of the situation. Daniel coughed, a wet rattling sound that drew Alexei's attention. "Hey," Daniel rasped, his voice carrying the broken quality of a man who had spent too many nights sleeping rough. "Hey, mister, you got a cigarette?" Alexei's lip curled in disgust. "Shut up, old man. Just 1 cigarette." Daniel started to stand, his movements slow, arthritic, the performance of a broken man who was no threat to anyone. "Please! I haven't smoked in 3 days. I'm dying here." "I said shut up." Alexei's hand moved toward his jacket, toward the weapon concealed beneath. "Sit down before I put you down." "I just need—" Daniel stumbled forward, his foot catching on the child's toy he had noted earlier. He fell, sprawling across the floor with a crash that drew every eye in the waiting room. Alexei took an instinctive step forward, his training overriding his contempt. His attention focused entirely on the pathetic figure lying at his feet. It was the last mistake Alexei Petrov would ever make. Daniel's fall had closed the distance between them to 3 feet. His stumble had positioned his body to shield the civilians from what was about to happen. His weakness had drawn the target exactly where he needed him. In one fluid motion, Daniel rolled onto his back and drove the blade upward. The knife entered Alexei's body at the precise angle necessary to slip between the 3rd and 4th ribs, penetrating the intercostal muscles and piercing the left ventricle of the heart. It was a killing stroke, silent and absolute, the kind of strike that required not just skill but an intimate understanding of human anatomy. Daniel had learned that anatomy in places where such knowledge meant survival. Alexei's eyes went wide, his mouth opening to scream, but no sound emerged. The heart couldn't pump blood to the lungs when there was a blade interrupting its rhythm. He crumpled forward and Daniel caught him, easing him to the ground with the gentleness of a man putting a child to bed. To the observers in the waiting room, it looked like the homeless man was helping someone who had collapsed. It looked like an act of kindness from an unlikely source. It didn't look like murder, but it was murder. Clean, efficient, necessary murder. Daniel lowered Alexei's body to the floor, retrieved his knife, and wiped the blade on the dead man's jacket. The entire sequence had taken less than 4 seconds. The mother with the sick child stared at him, confusion and horror warring on her face. She had seen something, had glimpsed the truth beneath the mask, but her mind refused to process it. Daniel met her eyes and shook his head once, a simple gesture that carried a universe of meaning. "Stay quiet. Stay safe." "Let me work," she nodded, pulling her child closer, turning away from the body that was now just another piece of furniture in the waiting room. Daniel stood up. The shuffle was gone from his movements. The hunch had disappeared from his shoulders. The broken old man had been replaced by something else entirely, something that moved with the fluid grace of a predator who had finally decided to hunt. He reached down and took Alexei's weapon from its holster, a Glock 19 with a threaded barrel and a suppressor already attached. Professional equipment for professional killers. Daniel checked the magazine. 15 rounds, plus 1 in the chamber. It would have to be enough. He moved toward the corridor where Victor and the second man had disappeared, his footsteps making no sound on the linoleum floor. Behind him, the waiting room sat in stunned silence, its occupants frozen by a primal instinct that recognized danger even when the conscious mind couldn't comprehend it. The wolf was no longer sleeping. The wolf was awake. The wolf was hunting. The corridor beyond the security door was a maze of white walls and numbered rooms, the kind of sterile labyrinth that could disorient visitors and staff alike. But Daniel Marsh had spent 20 minutes studying the hospital's layout during his 6 hours in the waiting room. He had memorized the placement of every exit, every junction, every potential choke point. Old habits didn't die. They waited in the dark, patient and hungry, ready to emerge when the world demanded their return. He moved through the corridor in a half-crouch, his body angled to present the smallest possible target, the suppressed Glock held in a 2-handed grip that would have been textbook at Quantico. His eyes swept each doorway, each shadow, each reflection in the polished floor. Ahead, he heard voices. Victor's thick accent cut through the hospital's ambient hum. "Wake him up. I don't care how. We need him conscious." A second voice, the one belonging to the man who had used the stolen keycard. "He's been sedated for the cardiac procedure. If we push too hard, he might code again." "Then work faster. We have 15 minutes before the extraction team arrives. I will not tell Mr. Volkov that we failed because of medical complications." Daniel processed this information instantly. Volkov. The name triggered memories of classified briefings, of photographs spread across tables in windowless rooms, of targets that had been deemed too politically sensitive to eliminate. Arkady Volkov was one of the most dangerous men in the world, a Russian oligarch who had built his empire on blood and blackmail and the systematic exploitation of anyone foolish enough to trust him. He had connections to the Kremlin, to the Chinese, to a dozen terrorist organizations that pretended to be enemies while sharing the same paymasters. If Volkov wanted someone in this hospital badly enough to send his personal kill team, then the patient in room 7 was holding information worth dying for, worth killing for. Daniel reached the junction that led to the cardiac ward. He pressed his back against the wall and risked a glance around the corner. Room 7 was 20 feet away. The door was open, and inside, Daniel could see Victor's massive frame looming over a hospital bed. The patient was an older man, gray-haired and frail, his body connected to a dozen machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical indifference. His eyes were half open, glazed with sedation, but flickering with a terror that no drug could fully suppress. The second operative stood by the window, his weapon drawn, watching the door. He was good, Daniel noted. His positioning covered both the entrance and the bed, allowing him to respond to threats from multiple directions, but he wasn't watching the ceiling. Daniel looked up. The corridor featured a suspended ceiling of acoustic tiles, the kind found in hospitals and office buildings across America. Lightweight, easily removable, creating a space above the visible hallway that could accommodate ductwork and wiring, and a man who knew how to move silently. Daniel holstered the Glock and jumped, catching the metal frame of the ceiling grid with both hands. He pulled himself up with the controlled strength of a man who had done thousands of pull-ups in military gyms around the world, his body disappearing into the darkness above the tiles. The space was cramped, filled with dust and the skeletal framework of the building's infrastructure. Daniel army-crawled through the darkness, his movements slow and deliberate, each shift of his weight calculated to avoid making the tiles below him sag or creak. He positioned himself directly above room 7. Through a gap in the tiles, he could see Victor slapping the sedated patient's face, trying to rouse him to consciousness. The patient, whose name was Gregory Harmon and who had been an NSA cryptographer for 30 years before his retirement, moaned weakly, his head lolling. "Wake up, Mr. Harmon." Victor's voice was patient, almost kind, the tone of a man who had all the time in the world to extract what he needed. "We know you have the cipher keys. We know you memorized them before you destroyed the physical copies. You thought you were being clever. You thought retirement would protect you." Harmon's eyes flickered open. I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you do." Victor produced a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "This is a very special compound. It makes people very cooperative. It also makes them very dead if administered incorrectly." "I am not a doctor, Mr. Harmon. My hands shake sometimes. I might make a mistake." The operative by the window shifted his weight, his attention momentarily focused on something outside, a movement in the parking lot, a flash of lights. It was enough. Daniel dropped through the ceiling tile directly above the operative, his body a controlled missile of muscle and bone. His knee drove into the man's shoulder, slamming him into the window frame with a crack that might have been glass or might have been vertebrae. The operative's weapon discharged once, the sound muffled by its suppressor, the bullet burying itself in the wall. Daniel's knife was in his hand before they hit the floor. He drove the blade into the operative's throat, severing the carotid artery and the jugular vein in a single stroke. Blood sprayed across the window, painting the glass with abstract patterns of crimson. The operative's eyes went wide, then empty, the light fading from them like a candle being snuffed. Victor spun, the syringe clattering to the floor, his hand reaching for the weapon at his hip. He was fast, terrifyingly fast for a man of his size, but Daniel Marsh was faster. Daniel hurled the knife with a motion that was half throw, half prayer. The blade tumbled through the air, not aimed at Victor's body but at his hand, at the weapon that was emerging from its holster. The knife struck the slide of Victor's pistol, knocking it from his grip, the blade embedding itself in the meat of his palm. Victor roared, a sound of pain and rage and disbelief, staring at the homeless vagrant who had just disarmed him with a thrown knife. "Who are you?" Victor demanded, blood dripping from his wounded hand. "Who the hell are you?" Daniel didn't answer. He was already moving, closing the distance between them, his body flowing through combat stances that had been drilled into him through years of training and decades of practice. Victor was a monster. 6'4", 300 pounds of muscle and murder, trained by the best special operations unit Russia had ever produced. He had killed men with his bare hands, had torn apart enemies who thought themselves prepared for violence. But Victor had never fought someone like Daniel Marsh. Daniel's first strike was a palm heel to Victor's solar plexus, delivered with the full weight of his body behind it. The blow landed with a sound like a baseball bat hitting a side of beef, driving the air from Victor's lungs and folding him forward. Victor responded with a wild hook that would have taken Daniel's head off if it had connected. Daniel slipped the punch, ducking beneath Victor's arm and driving an elbow into the Russian's kidney. Once, twice, 3 times. Each strike was precise, targeted, designed not just to cause pain, but to compromise specific organ systems. The kidneys, when struck repeatedly with sufficient force, begin to fail. The body diverts resources to cope with the damage, slowing reaction time, clouding judgment. Victor stumbled backward, his face contorted with agony. You're one of them. American Black Operations. I should have known." Daniel pressed his attack, driving a knee into Victor's thigh, targeting the femoral nerve cluster. Victor's leg buckled, and he fell to one knee, gasping. "You're right," Daniel said, speaking for the first time since the fight began. His voice was calm, conversational, the voice of a man discussing the weather rather than ending a life. "I'm one of them. I'm the ghost they send when all the other ghosts have failed." Victor lunged from his kneeling position, a desperate tackle aimed at Daniel's midsection. It was a fighter's last gambit, the move of a man who knew he was beaten but refused to accept it. Daniel sidestepped, caught Victor's arm as he passed, and twisted it behind his back in a joint lock that hyperextended the elbow to its breaking point. Victor screamed, a sound that echoed through the cardiac ward and brought nurses running from their stations. "The cipher keys," Daniel said, wrenching Victor's arm another inch toward destruction. "Who else knows Harmon has them? Who else is coming?" Victor laughed through his pain. "You think I'll tell you? You think—" Daniel dislocated Victor's shoulder with a single sharp motion. The sound was wet, organic, the sound of connective tissue surrendering to forces it was never designed to withstand. Victor screamed again, higher this time, the scream of a man whose body was betraying him. "I've done this before," Daniel said, his voice still calm, still conversational. "I've broken men who thought they couldn't be broken. I've found the places where courage fails and survival instinct takes over. We're going to find that place in you, Victor. We're going to find it, and you're going to tell me everything." The door to room 7 burst open. Nurses, security guards, Dr. Harrison Chen himself, all of them flooding into the room, all of them freezing at the sight before them. A homeless man covered in blood, holding a Russian giant in a submission hold that looked like something from a torture manual. A dead body by the window, its throat open to the air. A patient in the bed, staring with eyes that had suddenly become very, very awake. "Call the Pentagon," Daniel said, not taking his eyes off Victor. "Tell them you have a situation involving Arkady Volkov. Tell them Cipher 0 is in play, and tell them Daniel Marsh sends his regards." Dr. Chen's face went pale. Who the hell are you?" Daniel looked up at the doctor who had dismissed him as a vagrant, as a liability, as something to be swept away like garbage. "I'm the man you refused to treat," Daniel said. "I'm the man you were going to throw out into the street. I'm the man you thought was beneath your notice." He twisted Victor's arm again, drawing another scream. "And right now, I'm the only thing standing between this hospital and a very bad night." The chaos that followed Daniel's revelation was a masterclass in human panic. Nurses scattered, their training for medical emergencies utterly useless against the reality of blood and violence and a homeless man who had just dismantled a professional kill team. Security guards drew their weapons, their hands shaking so badly that Daniel could see their pistols trembling from across the room. Dr. Chen stood frozen, his arrogance shattered, his mind struggling to reconcile the vagrant he had dismissed with the lethal precision he had just witnessed. "Everyone out," Daniel commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had spent decades giving orders in the worst circumstances imaginable. "Everyone except the patient and the doctor. Now." Nobody moved. Daniel shifted his grip on Victor, applying pressure to a nerve cluster that made the Russian's entire body seize with agony. "I said now." They moved. The room emptied in seconds, leaving only Daniel, Victor, Dr. Chen, and Gregory Harmon, who was struggling to sit up in his hospital bed despite the tubes and wires connecting him to machines that were now beeping with increasing urgency. "You," Daniel said, looking at Chen. "Close the door, lock it. Then you're going to stabilize your patient while I finish my conversation with our Russian friend." I can't." Chen's voice was barely a whisper. "This is insane. I should call the police. "The police can't help you." Daniel's eyes were cold, ancient, the eyes of a man who had seen the darkest corners of human capability. "The people who sent Victor here own police officers. They own politicians. They own people you've never heard of in positions you can't imagine. The only thing standing between them and their objective is me. So you can either help me protect your patient, or you can get out of my way and let me do it alone." Chen looked at Victor, at the blood pooling on the floor, at the body of the operative Daniel had killed. Something shifted in his face, some calculation of risk and reward that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with survival. He closed the door. He locked it. "Good," Daniel said. "Now, Victor and I are going to have a conversation." Victor laughed, a broken sound that bubbled with blood and defiance. "You think I fear pain? I've been trained to resist interrogation by the best. You can't break me." "I don't need to break you." Daniel released Victor's arm, letting the Russian slump to the floor. "I just need to wait." "Wait for what?" Daniel checked his watch. In approximately 4 minutes, the extraction team your boss sent is going to arrive. They're going to find 2 of their colleagues dead and their primary operative incapacitated. They're going to make a decision. Either they come in hot, guns blazing, ready to kill everyone in this building to get what they want, or they cut their losses and run, leaving you behind to face the consequences of failure. Victor's face went pale. I've worked with men like Volkov before, Daniel continued, his voice almost gentle. I know how they think. I know how they reward success. I know how they punish failure. You've failed tonight, Victor. Even if you somehow escape, even if you somehow complete your mission, Volkov will know that an old man in a hospital waiting room took apart your entire operation. That's not the kind of story that leads to promotions. You're lying. Am I? Daniel crouched down, bringing his face level with Victor's. Look at me. Look at my eyes. Ask yourself if I'm the kind of man who needs to lie. Victor looked. Victor saw. Something in the Russian's expression crumbled, some last reserve of hope collapsing under the weight of recognition. He had seen eyes like Daniel's before, in the mountains of Chechnya, in the back rooms of the FSB, in the places where men went to do the things that kept their nation safe. The extraction team, Victor said, his voice hollow. 3 vehicles, 12 men. They're staging at a warehouse on South Halsted. They have helicopter support on standby if things go wrong. Daniel nodded, filing the information away. And Volkov, where is he? I don't know. Nobody knows. He moves constantly, changes locations every 48 hours. Even his closest associates only communicate through intermediaries. The cipher keys, why does he want them? Victor hesitated. Daniel's hand moved toward the wound in the Russian's palm, and Victor started talking. The keys unlock a database, NSA surveillance data. Every phone call, every email, every text message collected by American intelligence over the past decade. Volkov wants to sell it to the highest bidder, China, North Korea, Iran, whoever has the money. Gregory Harmon, the patient in the bed, made a sound that was half gasp and half sob. Oh God, I never thought, when they asked me to memorize the backup keys, I never thought. It doesn't matter what you thought, Daniel said, turning to face the old cryptographer. What matters is what we do now. Can you give me the keys? Harmon shook his head. They're not that kind of keys. They're not words or numbers. They're mathematical relationships, equations that generate unique values based on input parameters. Even if I told you everything I know, you couldn't use them without the proprietary hardware that the NSA destroyed after the program was compromised. Then why does Volkov want you? Because I can rebuild the hardware. Harmon's voice was bitter, defeated. I designed the original system. I can recreate it from memory. Given enough time and resources, I can unlock everything. Daniel absorbed this information. The situation had just become infinitely more complicated. This wasn't about retrieving data anymore. This was about preventing a single man from becoming the key to America's most closely guarded secrets. The phone on the wall began to ring. Everyone froze. Daniel moved to the phone and lifted the receiver. Yes. A voice on the other end, female, professional, with an accent that could have been American or British or something else entirely. Mr. Marsh, we know you're in there. We know you've neutralized our advance team. We're impressed, truly. But you're trapped in a building with limited exits and a patient who can't walk. Be reasonable. Reasonable is my middle name. Then let's negotiate. You give us Harmon, we give you a head start. Disappear back into whatever hole you've been hiding in. No one has to die tonight. Daniel looked at Harmon, at the fear in the old man's eyes, at the weight of secrets that had crushed his health and brought him to the brink of death. He looked at Chen, who was pretending to check the monitors while listening to every word. He looked at Victor, bleeding and broken on the floor. Counteroffer, Daniel said. You leave. You tell Volkov that the mission is blown. You cut your losses and find another way to destroy the Western world. And in exchange, I don't spend the next few years hunting down everyone involved in tonight's operation and removing them from the gene pool. Silence on the other end. That's not an acceptable counteroffer, Mr. Marsh. I wasn't offering. I was telling. Daniel's voice hardened. You've done your research on me. You know who I am. You know what I've done. You know that I'm not making empty threats, so ask yourself a question. Is Volkov's money worth dying for? Is it worth spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for the moment when I step out of the shadows? More silence. You have 3 minutes to leave the area, Daniel said. After that, I start making phone calls of my own, the kind of calls that bring helicopters and tactical teams and the full weight of American military power down on everyone within a 5-mile radius. Your choice. He hung up. Dr. Chen stared at him. Can you actually do that, make those kinds of calls? Daniel smiled, and there was no humor in it. I guess we're about to find out. The next 3 minutes were the longest of everyone's lives. Daniel positioned himself by the window, watching the parking lot below. The suppressed Glock held ready. Chen worked on stabilizing Harmon, his hands shaking but his training taking over. Victor lay on the floor, his breathing ragged, his eyes fixed on Daniel with an expression that might have been hatred or might have been respect. At the 2-minute mark, Daniel saw movement. 3 black SUVs that had been parked near the emergency entrance started their engines. Their headlights came on, cutting through the rain. For a moment, they sat there, idling, their occupants presumably weighing their options. Then they moved, not toward the hospital, away from it. The SUVs pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared into the Chicago night, their taillights fading like dying stars. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They're gone, he said. For now. Chen looked up from Harmon's monitors. For now? What does that mean? Are they coming back? Eventually. Volkov doesn't give up easily, but tonight they've decided that discretion is the better part of valor. Daniel turned from the window. Which means we have time to do this properly. He pulled out a phone that wasn't a phone, a device that looked like a cheap burner, but was actually a quantum-encrypted communicator that had been issued to him by an agency that officially didn't exist. He dialed a number from memory. It rang twice. Identify, said a voice that could have been male or female, human or computer-generated. Marsh Daniel. Clearance Omega-7. Authorization code Sleeping Lion. Clearance confirmed. What is your situation? I'm at Mercy General Hospital in Chicago. I have a code Obsidian asset under threat. Russian operatives, likely working for Arkady Volkov. I've neutralized the immediate threat, but the asset needs extraction and protection. Understood. We're scrambling a team now. ETA 20 minutes. Can you hold? I can hold. One more thing, Mr. Marsh. Yes? Welcome back. The line went dead. Daniel lowered the phone and found Chen staring at him with an expression that mixed fear and awe and something that might have been shame. You're not homeless, Chen said slowly. You were never homeless. I am homeless, Daniel replied. I've been homeless for 3 years, living on the streets, eating out of dumpsters, sleeping under bridges. Everything you saw was real. But why? With your skills, with your connections. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of pain and loss and regret. Because I was tired, he said. Tired of the killing. Tired of the secrets. Tired of being a weapon. I thought if I disappeared, if I became invisible, I could finally find peace. He looked at his hands, at the blood that still stained them. I should have known better. Men like me don't get peace. We get moments between storms. The door to the room shuddered. Someone was trying to get in. Daniel raised the Glock, then lowered it as he heard Patricia's voice through the door. Dr. Chen, the police are here. They're demanding to know what's happening. Chen looked at Daniel. What do I tell them? The truth. Some of it anyway. There was an attempted kidnapping. The perpetrators were driven off by a patient who turned out to have a military background. The authorities are being notified through proper channels. And what about you? Daniel moved toward the window. Outside, the rain was finally slowing, the storm passing over the city like a giant hand releasing its grip. In about 15 minutes, some very serious people are going to arrive. They're going to take Harmon somewhere safe. They're going to clean up this mess. And they're going to ask questions about me that you won't be able to answer. He turned to face Chen one last time. When they ask, tell them the truth. Tell them I was a patient you refused to treat. Tell them I was a liability you wanted removed. Tell them you looked at me and saw nothing worth saving. His eyes held Chen's unflinching. And then tell them that sometimes the people we dismiss are the ones holding the line between civilization and chaos. Chen's face crumbled. I'm sorry, God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't look. Daniel's voice was not angry. It was something worse. It was sad. You see homeless people every day, Doctor. Veterans, mentally ill, people who fell through the cracks of a society that doesn't have room for its wounded. And you look away. You all look away. He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. Maybe tonight will teach you to look. Maybe the next time some broken person sits in your waiting room, you'll remember that everyone has a story. Everyone has value. Everyone deserves at least the courtesy of being seen. Daniel unlocked the door and stepped into the corridor. Patricia stood there, her face pale, flanked by 2 Chicago police officers who looked like they had no idea what they were walking into. Sir, one of the officers said, his hand on his holster. We're going to need you to come with us. Daniel smiled. No, you're not. He handed the officer a card. It was blank except for a phone number. Call that number, tell them Daniel Marsh sends his regards, then stand down and wait for the real authorities to arrive. The officer looked at the card, looked at Daniel, looked at the blood on his clothes and the calm certainty in his eyes. Something in that look made him reach for his radio instead of his weapon. 10 minutes later, the helicopters arrived. They landed in the parking lot of Mercy General Hospital, black shapes against the gray Chicago sky, their rotors kicking up whirlwinds of rain and debris. Men in unmarked uniforms emerged, their faces hidden behind tactical gear, their movements carrying the precision of elite operators. A woman stepped out of the lead helicopter. She was in her 50s, silver-haired, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Her eyes scanned the hospital entrance until they found Daniel standing by the ambulance bay, alone in the rain. She walked toward him. Her heels clicked on the wet pavement with each step. Daniel, she said, Director, you look terrible. I feel terrible. She stopped in front of him, studying his face with an expression that mixed professional assessment with something that might have been personal concern. 3 years, she said, 3 years off the grid. We thought you were dead. I wanted to be, but you're not. No. Daniel looked up at the hospital, at the windows of the cardiac ward where the chaos had unfolded. I'm not. The director followed his gaze. The asset is secure. My team is extracting him now. The Russian casualties will be attributed to gang violence, the hospital staff will be debriefed and released with appropriate confidentiality agreements. And Victor? He's being taken to a facility where he'll have plenty of time to share everything he knows about Volkov's operations. She paused. He's also given us interesting information about how you questioned him. The medical team says he'll need surgery on his shoulder. He'll live. Yes, he will, which is more mercy than he deserved. The director turned to face Daniel directly. You saved a lot of lives tonight. You prevented a catastrophic intelligence breach. You did all of this while suffering from what our medical team suspects is stage 2 pancreatic cancer. Daniel's expression didn't change. I know, he said. That's why I was in the emergency room. I've known for a month. Figured I might as well try to get it confirmed before... He didn't finish the sentence. The director was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost its professional edge. We have resources, Daniel. The best oncologists in the world, experimental treatments that aren't available to the public. If you come back, we can fight this. I don't want to fight anymore. I know, but sometimes the fight comes to you anyway. She gestured at the hospital. Tonight proved that. You can run from who you are, but you can't run from what you are. You're a protector, Daniel. You always have been. Even when you don't want to be. Daniel looked at her, at the helicopters behind her, at the men in tactical gear who were already disappearing into the hospital to clean up the mess he had made. If I come back, he said slowly, it's on my terms. Name them. I don't kill anymore, not unless there's no other choice. Agreed. I don't disappear anymore. No black sites, no off-book operations, no pretending I don't exist. That might be more complicated, but we can work something out. And the cancer, if it can't be treated, if the doctors say there's no hope, you let me go. You don't keep me alive just because my skills are useful. You let me choose my own ending." The director was silent for a long time. "Agreed," she finally said. Daniel nodded. He looked at the hospital one last time, at the place where he had been dismissed and discounted and deemed unworthy of care. Dr. Chen was standing at the entrance watching him. The doctor raised one hand in a hesitant wave that might have been gratitude or apology or farewell. Daniel didn't wave back. He turned and walked toward the helicopters, toward the future he had tried to escape, toward the identity he had tried to bury. Behind him, the rain finally stopped. The story spread through Mercy General Hospital like wildfire in the days that followed. The official version, the one that appeared in police reports and hospital records, spoke of an attempted kidnapping foiled by quick-thinking security and the intervention of law enforcement. It was a boring story, a safe story, a story that answered no questions and raised no flags. But the staff knew the truth, or at least they knew enough of it. They knew that a homeless veteran had sat in their waiting room for 6 hours, suffering in silence while doctors and nurses walked past him without a second glance. They knew that same veteran had risen up when violence came calling and had done things that none of them could explain or understand. They knew that he had saved them all. Dr. Harrison Chen resigned from Mercy General 2 weeks after the incident. He enrolled in a rehabilitation program for his prescription drug addiction and began volunteering at a free clinic on the South Side, treating patients who had no insurance and no hope and no one to speak for them. He never forgot the look in Daniel Marsh's eyes when he had said, "You didn't know because you didn't look." Patricia, the triage nurse, started a program to ensure that homeless patients received the same standard of care as anyone else who walked through their doors. She called it the Marsh Initiative, though she never told anyone where the name came from. Security guard Marcus, who had spent the evening watching Daniel with contempt, quit his job and joined the Chicago Fire Department. He said he wanted to be someone who helped people instead of judging them. And somewhere, in a facility that didn't appear on any map, a man named Daniel Marsh underwent experimental treatment for a cancer that should have killed him. The doctors said his survival was a miracle. The director said it was stubbornness. Daniel said it was unfinished business because the world was full of predators like Viktor Kozlov and Arkady Volkov. The world was full of people who would hurt the innocent and exploit the vulnerable and burn everything down for profit and power. And the world needed wolves to hunt those predators. Even old wolves, even wounded wolves, even wolves who had tried to become sheep and discovered that they couldn't change their nature. 6 months after the incident at Mercy General, an encrypted message arrived at the CIA's Counterterrorism Center. It contained detailed intelligence about Arkady Volkov's operations, including the locations of his safe houses, the names of his operatives, and the routes of his money laundering networks. The message was signed with a single word, sleeping. No one at the CIA knew what it meant. But somewhere in the shadows, Daniel Marsh smiled. The lion was awake. The hunt was on. Most people who walked past that homeless veteran in the emergency room saw nothing worth noticing. They saw a problem. They saw a burden. They saw someone who had fallen so far that they couldn't possibly matter anymore. They were wrong. Because true power isn't about wealth or status or the white coats we wear. True power is about what rises up in us when everything else has been stripped away. It's about the core that remains when the world has done its worst. Daniel Marsh had nothing. No home, no family, no future that anyone could see. He had been thrown away by a society that had used him up and deemed him disposable. But in that moment of crisis, when predators came hunting and innocent lives hung in the balance, he discovered something that all his years of black operations had never taught him. You don't need resources to be a hero. You don't need recognition. You don't need permission. You just need to be willing to stand up when everyone else is running away. The next time you walk past someone who seems invisible, who seems broken, who seems like nothing more than a problem to be ignored, remember this story. Remember that you never know what's sleeping beneath that surface. Some of the most dangerous people in the world look like victims, and some of the greatest heroes look like they've given up.